This talk is about reading and reading quickly. And I've read a lot of different speed reading books and things like that. And although there's some good information, a lot of it didn't work for me. So let me start out by saying that I'm a pretty slow reader. So this talk is about how to read quickly if you're a slow reader. And this sort of goes back a number of years. I was hanging out with an old friend of mine. His name is Matt, and so we were talking, and somehow we came upon the topic of what do we do in the evening. And I was saying, well, I'll watch Netflix or something. And I said, what do you do most evenings? And he said, well, I read a book. And I said, oh, you read? And I said, well, are you an avid reader? And he said, yeah, I think you would say that. And so I kept inquiring, and it turns out that most evenings he'll read a whole book. So I was pretty impressed that he'll sit down and read a book, usually cover to cover, in an evening. And I thought, well, that's amazing. He must be a really quick reader. And so I got very curious, and I did a little informal modeling of him, just being very curious about what he does. And the thing that was most remarkable, or the thing that stood out the most about what he does, is he reads a book in his own words. He reads a book that he can't put down. So, and for me, this is a very particular thing. I'm sure you've had the experience of reading a good book or even a great book, but then there are books that you literally can't put down. You're so immersed in the experience of the book that it's hard to put it down. And for me, one of my tests for this is this a book that I find myself staying up past my usual bedtime or reading in the middle of the day when I should be focusing on work? If those things happen, I know I've stumbled on one of these books that I can't put down. So what does this do, and what can we do with it? Well, what I find is if I read a book that I can't put down, a few things happen. One is naturally I'm much more engaged in the book. I'm immersed in it, like I said, and I want to know what happens. So every time I'm reading, I'm actually reading a bit longer than I would usually. Like my reading sessions stretch out. So that's one thing that has a huge impact in terms of how much I read. The second thing that happens is I'm actually picking up the book many, many more times. And what I found is when I'm reading a book in this category, this type of engagement really trumps reading speed. So if I was reading a book that I wasn't that engaged in, and I was a quick reader, I probably wouldn't be picking the book up very much. So at the end of the day, I'm not going to read as much. But this type of book, I find I'll just plow through the book, probably not in a day, but sometimes in a couple days, which is really outstanding for someone like me that reads typically pretty slowly. So how do we do this? And what was interesting is Matt had a very particular way of going about this, because I asked him, I said, well, where do you find these books? Now, some of it is from recommendations, and I'll mention that in a second. But the other thing is, Matt would go to the bookstore, and he'd go to the bookstore quite often, and he would do what I call, he was browsing. I call it grazing. He would just move around the bookstore and see what was grabbing his attention. The way Matt reads, it's usually fiction books in this case. So this is a little bit different than reading nonfiction, although there is a version of this kind of approach that also works for nonfiction books. So Matt would graze around the store, and then he would see something that catches his attention, and he'd pick up the book, and he'd be sort of excited, and he would immerse himself in the cover and see if that was grabbing his attention. He might read the back cover. And then he would open the book to a couple places at random and just start reading somewhere in the middle of the book. And he was sort of testing the degree to which it pulled him into the world of the book. So he'd read a page or two in one place, and then he'd flip maybe towards the back, and he'd read again and get pulled in, or see if he got pulled in. And then he might read some of the introduction or just the beginning of the first chapter to see, is this a book that was giving him the feeling of being pulled into it? And if it was, he would buy the book, and that would be a book that he would read either that night or later that week. He also said when he was reading a book, he would usually give it, he said, about 50 pages. And if he wasn't completely immersed in the book, he would usually either put it off to read another time or just discard it. So that was Matt's way of sort of getting into a book and getting pulled in such a way that it, like, the whole experience pulled him more than watching a compelling Netflix show. Um, Now, what I did with this when I found this out, I realized immediately what he was talking about, because there were a couple books that I literally couldn't put down. I was staying up into the middle of the night, which isn't common for me, and I would be up 2, 3 hours past my bedtime reading. And one book or one book series, the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, I finished the second book at around 11:30 p.m. and I tried to download the third one only to find out that it hadn't been released yet. And I was so out of sorts that I quickly searched for books that were in a similar genre and downloaded them and started reading that. Now, knowing that this is such a powerful thing, what I've done is I go around and when I'm meeting somebody or just hanging out with one of my friends, I'll kind of explain this distinction of, a great book, because there are plenty of great books that you sort of savor, but a great book is different than a book you can't put down. So I ask all my friends, what's a book you couldn't put down? And I keep a list of these. And I will say that everyone has different criteria for what that means. One of my friends couldn't put down a nonfiction book, and when I read it, I found it engaging, but it didn't have that same quality for me. So I'll probably still finish that book at some point, but it's not something that I need to finish today, so to speak. But I have to say, this list of books that I've gotten from people has been really mind blowing, and it's kept me reading at a clip that's quite amazing. The other thing I noticed is certain people their taste is very similar to mine. So there's one guy in particular. His name is Lane, and if I go to Lane and he recommends something, at this point, even if it seems like completely out of my range of interest, I'll immediately get it because he's been right, um, probably 90% of the time, where he turns me on to a certain book and I can't stop reading it. He turned me on to the Macy Dobbs series that I really recommend. So the books on the thumbnail are books that are like that for me. I mean, a small sampling of those. The other thing I recommend is, which may seem kind of obvious, but if you stumble on one book like that by an author, there's a good chance that all of their books will be in that category. So if you've never thought about this distinction, I know it seems kind of obvious, but it's actually quite powerful at the same time. Sometimes the most obvious is also the most powerful. So I recommend you ask your friends for a book that they couldn't put down, and you may want to just sort of test how long does it take you to finish one of those books compared to just a typical book that you're reading. And I hope you enjoy that.